Okay. Yeah, I'm wondering, do you think do you think in 5 years Tesla will be able to remove the steering wheel from a car? Like let's say in the robotaxi network, or do you think that we're gonna have that steering wheel for much longer, for let's say this whole decade or
I think the
so?
steering wheel is going to come out. It's, whether it's the Model 2
Hmm.
or some future Model 3, the steering wheels will come out of cars. I, I really think, there's a point not too far in the future where we're going to look back in horror that we ever let people drive cars,
Uh-huh.
right? My dad grew up working on a farm, right? And he has these horrifying stories of industrial farm accidents, right?
Mm,
And it today it's inconceivable
yeah.
that we would let people work those kinds of jobs that were that dangerous, right? And so you definitely get the sense when you hear him tell these stories about, that was a different world back then.
Yeah.
And I think, a decade after self-driving cars come on the scene, we're going to be in that kind of space. Like, oh my God, how could you let your child in a,
Yeah. Yeah.
drive in a car driven by a human being? What a
Yeah.
irresponsible person you are.
Yeah. With Tesla, it seems like, there's a lot of different pieces that, are coming together for their kind of full self-driving future. I mean, you've got, the hardware components, you've got the training stuff, you've got the actual, let's say, architecture of their neural nets, and you've got like a network, a fleet of vehicles out there where Tesla can use to get data and train. How do you think um, how will other companies be able to compete with Tesla if they don't have like the amount of vehicles on the road to get kind of real life training data? Do you think that's how big of an advantage do you think that is for Tesla? And can other companies in the foreseeable future, let's say the next 2 to 5 years, can they somehow, overcome, right, the challenge of this data issue that they're facing?
So Tesla's approach is data heavy. They've got access to a lot of data and they're leveraging it. There are approaches that are less data heavy. Waymo and Cruise are using less data heavy approaches. In a sense, they don't need to overcome Tesla's data advantage because of the approach that they're taking. Their business model is different, right? They're doing, high definition maps and they're area constrained, and all the vehicles are operated by a fleet operator. They're not individual vehicles. Um, on top of that, over the next several years, all of these players are expanding into a huge TAM that's a total vacuum, right? So, like, you would sort of expect them to all expand for a long time before they even bump into each other in this market, right? And like, I would be shocked if they actually were bumping up against each other 3 years from now, or even 5 or 8 years from now. They have different use cases, they have different customer bases. I mean, Waymo and Cruise, they're pretty much the same model, right? So you can see them
Hmm.
bump into each other. They both want to go into New York. There's only
Sure.
so many
Uh-huh.
cars, so many garages, or whatever the deal is. But Tesla's customer base and Mobileye is another case where you have somebody building a platform that they're going to sell to uh, OEMs, right? Who are going to
Hmm.
combine it in their own car. And then there's Comma, right?
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting play. Like, I don't see how Comma succeeds in the long run, but it's a really interesting what they're doing. And George Hotz has alluded to, well, maybe insurance is their play or something like that. And maybe it is. Maybe that's the right way to go. But the whole thing where, like, there's a massive market of people buying add-on things that they plug in their car and drive around. Like, it's hard to see that market getting really big, but it's a strange world. Who knows? I
Yeah.
I don't think Comma bumps into Tesla, right? They're not selling to the same customer base, and I don't think Mobileye does either.
Yeah.
And Waymo and Cruise, they're in a whole space of their own also.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's fun when you talk about these things to
Hmm.
play the,
Yeah.
who's going to win whatever thing. But I think the market is so big
Yeah.
that these guys, they're just going to avoid running into each other for a
Uh-huh.
really long time.
How much do you think Tesla can charge for this full self-driving? In let's say when they get robo taxis on the road,
Oh,
and
for
it's
the software
exactly
itself.
so let's say
Oh God.
so let's say let's say 4 years down the road, let's say 2024, 2025, you've had robo-taxis on the road for about 2 years, and
Right.
the kinks are kind of, worked out a bit. And this is like robo taxis are growing. People are putting their cars on the network. People are excited about this whole thing. Tesla's clearly in the lead. How much can Tesla sell their full self-driving, this, autonomous driving
That's a
feature
really
for? What do you think?
interesting
I mean,
question.
already it's,
Like I've thought about it quite. Like
yeah.
if I could have. What's it worth? Like that's a really interesting question, right?
Mhm.
And you can do this calculus, this calculation that they did at Autonomy Day, where they said basically, let's assume we sell it for half of Uber, and you buy a car and it costs this much, and you operate it this way, and you get this much utilization. Well, what's it worth? You figure cost of money value thing, and you come up with a number like $200,000 or $300,000 with those assumptions going in. But an interesting question is, how does Tesla transition from the world that we're in right now, where they're selling it as a $10,000 add-on to a private vehicle that it's useful, but it's
Mhm.
not a moneymaker for them at that case, to a world where okay, I've got this car I can sell, and if I sell a model, if I sell a Model 3 or for $40,000 with this $10,000 add-on, somebody could buy it and immediately, flip it
Mhm.
for $200,000 or something.
Uh-huh.
Well, clearly that's not going to happen.
Mhm.
Tesla's not going to leave that money on the table, and I don't know how they're going to enforce it. Whether it's going to be contractual restrictions or they'll have technical limitations on how it could be used. But somehow they're going to capture a significant amount of that value, and they're going to leave some of it on the table because they want people. I mean, Teslas are kind of an interesting, the model that they have outlined is different. It's not just different from like what Waymo is doing, in the sense that they're not using LiDAR,
Mhm.
right? They're building a vehicle that's significantly less expensive, right? Uh, but they're also not talking about the primary distribution mechanism being selling it to big fleets that are basically going to, pick a geographic area and then operate inside that area. They've actually got this model, which is kind of a hybrid of Uber, right? Where essentially your technology enables a large number of small business owners, right? Where
Mhm.
maybe 100 cars is a small business owner, or maybe 3 cars is a small business owner. You create this marketplace,
Mhm.
right? And then you, and then the customers are essentially acquiring these vehicles. At least you have a space of customers who are acquiring these vehicles to operate as a business, and that has interesting financials, right? Because Tesla doesn't pay for those vehicles; somebody else pays for those vehicles, and so if they go that route, then
Mhm.
they're going to want to price it in a way to make that business attractive, right? They're not going to try to take 90% of the gains, right? I mean, Tesla talked about taking 30% or whatever. Maybe they take 50%, but they have to leave enough on the table that it's an attractive business and a lot of people want to get into it, because ultimately they want to scale their production, their vehicle production, and they want people using it. And something that gets left aside on the whole mission, we talk about replacing gas cars with electric cars, but make if an electric car gets used 10 times as much as it otherwise would, it's replacing 10 times as many gas cars, at least today, where
Mhm.
most of the vehicle miles you're going to displace are going to
Mhm.
be petroleum based vehicles, right? So one way to get a ton of leverage on the EVs that you're pushing out into the market is basically try to create a model where they get used a lot more. And you could imagine that might have been the genesis of this whole thing. Like, how do we make it so that when somebody buys a car, they loan it to lots of other people? So it's not just you, it's your groceries, and yeah, it's your neighbors, and so
Mhm.
essentially, let's get them out there and let's have them driving 100,000 miles a year instead of 10,000 miles a year. And now that's 10 times as many vehicles as I'm displacing. And in that scenario, even if you're only making 20 million vehicles a year, you're just, I mean, that might be
Uh-huh.
the whole car market at
Uh-huh.
that point, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's like, I mean, some people have speculated like, a Tesla can, like, charge $100,000 for the full self-driving option.
Oh yeah.
And I'm not like, personally, I'm kind of a little bit skeptical in some ways. I mean, recently, there's this YouTube channel called Now You Know, with Zach and Jesse, and they're smart guys,
Mm-hmm.
and they kind of hypothesize that Tesla could actually end up um, they could stop selling cars because they would just
Mm-hmm.
hoard the cars for
Yeah.
their own Tesla networks. And I kind of disagree on a few things on this kind of hyper $100,000 or whatever option. I think the first thing is, if Tesla does, let's say, let's say assume that Tesla gets there first, and rolls out robotaxi, it passes regulators. Tesla, I think initially for the first few years, maybe 2 years, 3 years, can charge exorbitant amounts, but I think that could leave a real bad taste in people's mind, in like feeling like, oh, Tesla's just milking everything and overcharging, or just charging everything they can. It's like, as you said, they want to leave enough on the table. They want to, they're long-term minded, they're not really looking to scalp a couple of years of crazy profits, at the expense of their brand. And I think once Tesla is able to roll out robotaxi, and let's say they charge $20,000-$30,000 for the full self-driving option, I think that's going to create this massive forcing function, an economic incentive for all of the major companies in the tech companies, AI companies in the world to invest massively in autonomous driving, because no one wants to, they're not going to want to leave Tesla to monopolize, this whole industry. And so you'll have, everyone just spending massive amounts. They're going to pivot. I think, like, for example, even with Waymo or Cruise or whoever is around at that time, they'll just, like, I think before that time, they'll start to see the inevitable rollout of robotaxi, and they'll be like, hey, we need to copy this, and poach engineers and try to be, they'll be a couple years behind. But I think at a certain point, it's like, especially when robotaxi rolls out and Tesla's like making a lot, I don't see other companies taking that much longer, maybe 3 years or so before, they are able to release a competent competing product. And then once a competent competing product hits the road, then Tesla can't charge their, exorbitant, whatever, 100,000. And so
yeah, in the long run, it's not going to be huge, right? Because, when, if you look down the road where, not just Tesla, or even if it's only a couple people plus Tesla, right, that there's going to be competition, it's going to drive costs down, and, robotaxis get commoditized. And at that point, autopilot isn't, long-term autopilot isn't $100,000 option. It'll get priced down to, whatever the market can bear in a commodity market, which tends to be fairly low. But yeah, there'll be this window of time. And for them to take appropriate advantage of it, you don't want to go too high, because you don't want to squeeze your market off. You want to encourage adoption and that kind of stuff. You also have this problem of, like, if you sell it for $100,000 and then next year you have to sell it for $50,000 because that's all the market will tolerate, then the people who paid $100,000 for it are going to be a little bitter about that situation, right? Yeah. And that's definitely something where, you can tarnish your brand. You can leave a bad taste in people's mouth on that kind of stuff. It's going to be. This is I've been having an argument about this with a good friend of mine for several years now. We have a long-standing bet, actually, that we did, say it was probably like 3 or 4 years ago, where he bet me that Tesla would stop selling cars to individuals when when they had a robotaxi. Because when he does the math on paper, he just cannot see a way that it makes sense. Yeah. If you've got, a robotaxi capability that's like real honest to God, it can go anywhere, it can drive people, that it makes any sense to sell cars to individual drivers at all when he does it. And I mean, my disagreement with him is partly it's sport, but the other thing is I feel like Tesla's got to transition from what they do now into that brave new world. And they've done a really interesting thing where they have been very careful about not letting people disintermediate them from their customers, from the ultimate customer. Like they don't use distributors, but they also don't use the press. They've been super careful not to let any other entity or institution or company get between them and controlling the thing that ultimately determines their destiny. So, in a sense that, the selling to fleets disintermediates you. It creates an entity between you and the ultimate customer. Yeah. So my sense is just that they wouldn't go that way, because it feels to me like it's not their style.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like my hunch is Tesla does kind of create their own fleets for, urban metro areas. So they have, their own kind of production. But then I think it's it's in Tesla's like ethos to partner with their customers, with the end consumer, not to I think Elon doesn't look at the end consumer as someone just to like use or to profit out of. He sees this as we're in this together, and I think because of that, I think Tesla will probably have some limit of the number of robo taxis you can buy or even put on the network. Maybe it might cap out at 10 or so. So there won't be these abuses of like people buying 100 or 1,000, etc.
Well, it's also a good way to make sure that nobody gets a stranglehold on your
Mhm.
delivery channel,
Yeah,
right?
that's true too.
It's
Yeah.
like, wait, you can't buy 100,000 vehicles. We won't sell them to you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. But yeah, so I kind of foresee Tesla in the future, they're building this logistics network, this transportation as a service, getting people, but also goods from point A to point B. They'll kind of have this, and it'll be supplemented by, owners' cars as well, who voluntarily put their, cars on the network. Um, I'm curious, like, have you thought about kind of like any of this, like beyond people, like logistics of moving, freight or goods or delivery of goods, items, food, services from point A to B? Do you think this is something in Tesla's future where, Tesla, leverages this whole robotaxi, fleet that they have, but also the owners' cars, and somehow, gets into new forms of businesses that are extensions, let's say, of transportation. Let's say, you know, delivering stuff, delivering networks, transportation of goods from
They're making semi,
well, from one end of the country to the other. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. What's your thoughts on all this?
it's, I mean, my head kind of explodes as soon as I start to get too far away from right. Because,
Mm-hmm.
you know, they're building a foothold on something that's foundational to so many things that I feel like you can say, well, they could do this and it's true, they could do this, or they could do this other thing and it would be super high profit margin. And that's also true.
Yeah,
But it's one company and they've got finite bandwidth,
yeah,
right? I mean, Apple they don't write all the apps on the App Store, right? They build this infrastructure and they focus on making it really good and pulling customers into it. And then they leave a lot for other people to do, and all this innovation and risk taking happens. And, all of these amazing things happen because they create this framework that other people can build on. And Apple has its own apps that also appear on the App Store that
yeah,
just sit on the thing, and they're good in their niche. Um, I think that's something I can get my head around, this
yeah,
idea
yeah.
that they might do
Got
that.
it.
But yeah, it seems like, the opportunities are pretty
Yeah.
big. And it's like, I noticed, I haven't watched your video on Starlink yet, but,
Uh-huh.
I think about
Yeah.
SpaceX and Starlink.
Yeah.
SpaceX, there's this platform that they're building,
Mm-hmm.
right, that enables, it's a little bit further down the road, but all of these really interesting possibilities. I mean, they're
Yeah.
doing communication right now, but they could do
Yeah.
Earth observation. They could do all kinds of other, things that might be really interesting. Now, they decided to do communication themselves. They could have decided they were just going to be the
Yeah.
platform
That's true.
and not do that. I think it was smart for them
Yeah.
to do this, because somebody else, coming out of the woodwork and saying, yeah, we're going to rely on
Yeah.
SpaceX to deliver our 30,000 satellite constellation. I mean, that's kind of a bridge too far for your typical
Yeah.
board of directors to kind of look at that and, yeah, we'll give you $20 billion for that, for
Yeah.
that business plan. But SpaceX themselves can do it, and it
Mm-hmm.
gives them the volume that they need to get
Yeah.
the launch frequency that
Yeah.
they want to drive back into their business.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But in the long run, does it make sense for them to try to take as many of those as they can? And I think the answer is no. I
Yeah.
think that once you've got enough stuff that gets you to the scale that you want, that you're better off providing the platform
Sure.
and letting other people specialize
Sure.
and have competition within those specialties too.
Sure. I'm wondering, like one of the kind of business models I think Tesla could go into. I doubt they'll go into because it's a little bit kind of shady, but I won't say shady, but there's this huge data market where, people pay a lot of money to analyze like what's going on around the world. Like, for example, you can count the number of cars on a road at a certain time, or the number of cars in a parking lot, or the number of customers, et cetera, just like what's going on, because you could see economic trends before other people. You can see these things in real time, and this is a huge business because a lot of money can be made off of this stuff. And so, in some ways, with Tesla's just mobile fleet of millions and eventually tens of millions of cars with, all these cameras around, they could actually be this huge fleet of data learning, basically observing the world, what everything's going, where everything is going, where cars are going, what stores are getting more traffic versus less traffic compared to the week before, the month before. I mean, with this data, you can map out so much of the physical world, but and there's actually quite a bit of money to be made, but it kind of, there's some, it again, with your point, it kind of diverts kind of the mission, right? Tesla's mission is to, expedite, to accelerate the transition of the world to sustainable energy. And so some of these business models, even though, like another company might be tempted to do it and they would do it because it makes money, I think Tesla in some ways, they probably will forego some of these business models that just, they seem opportunistic, but they don't really match their mission, and they'll go ahead and focus on their mission and create maybe new business models or new products that further that mission. And, that could, further their growth in the future.
There's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah.
It's worth keeping in mind that they're engineering limited, right?
Yeah.
That they have this stable of people and they push them really, really hard. Mm-hmm. And they go, they build their way up the important things, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
The things that feed back into their mission and, yeah. Lay the foundation for the future and whatnot. And like I said, I think Starlink is kind of the exception that kind of proves the rule on this kind of thing. I mean, there's a very specific reason for SpaceX to do Starlink, which is in a sense kind of, off the track of but it feeds that, it's so profitable and it provides them the launch volume that they need. Are there opportunities like that for Tesla? I think there might be. But I think anything that's not a huge opportunity like that, that's basically going to throw off so much cash that it makes a meaningful difference in their ability to execute, is just not going to make sense for them to do because they just don't have the people.
Exactly. What do you think? Do you think Tesla will release an app store for their cars? And
that would be interesting.
So, like, what kind of, like, when do you foresee that? Is that something that you think is in the coming few years?
We're getting really far away from my expertise here, so I don't know if I have a lot to offer.
Okay, well, we'll talk
on these kind of topics. That would be really interesting. I've seen it speculated that, and I think Elon said this, right? That in the long run, it's entertainment and productivity that becomes a problem because the vehicles get commoditized, right? Everybody's using them. And so, the added value thing that you can differentiate yourself with is, Tesla's making movies because they're the Netflix of in-car entertainment or whatever the deal is. Sure, we can see that.
Yeah, exactly. I'm curious, like with AI, what like Tesla is, it seems like in the world of kind of image processing and autonomous driving, like it seems pretty apparent that Tesla is like pushing the envelope, with what they're doing there. What would be like a handful of other companies out there in different fields that you think, and this is kind of diverging from Tesla a bit, but you think are just top of the game AI, players? I mean, obviously Google is the world renowned, they've got a ton of AI experts and they've, basically reinvented their whole company around, AI in recent years. But besides Google, like what other companies, besides, let's say, Google and Tesla, what other companies do you think are just top of game AI? And, just you think the next 10 years or so, you just see them as like, wow, these companies are really just going to grow?
We're in an interesting, era of the evolution of this kind of stuff. Startup companies didn't, there was a long period of time when startup companies weren't really a thing, right? And then startup companies came out and they became a way for for talented people or people with a good idea at a big company to like join a small company and do something that ends up making a big difference in the world, making a ton of money, affecting a lot of companies and whatnot. It kind of feels like with AI, the pendulum has kind of swung a little bit the other way right now. And
Mhm.
a lot of the critical expertise in AI right now has been coming out of academic institutions, right? I mean, they've pulled professors and grad students and that kind of stuff. And it feels like those people mostly want to go to big companies, right? And so they've been hoovered up by Microsoft and at Facebook, actually. I would say after Google, probably Facebook has the best, staple of data scientists and, people really on the cutting edge of stuff. But yeah, uh, big companies have taken the lion's share of this expertise. There seems like there's a trend in a lot of these developments where they're starting to take really big resources, right? I mean, nobody knows for sure exactly what GPT-3 costs to train,
Mhm.
but we're probably millions of dollars, maybe $10 million or something like that. So a lot of interesting applications. The headliners are starting to become out of range of what small companies can do.
Mhm.
And so that means, the answer to that question in that context as well, everybody knows, it's Google, FaceTime, Microsoft, Amazon, the people who can spend a ton of money and can really, um, uh, offer the kind of climate that somebody leading academia wants
Mhm.
when they go into, um, when they get a job. That said, there's a huge number of stealth companies out there that none of us have heard of, right?
Mhm.
That are working on really interesting things that are going to be super important, but where it's really hard to see how uh, it's really hard to see today
Mhm.
exactly what the contribution is going to be. So I feel like there's these big obvious answers to that,
Yeah.
which aren't very interesting because they're big and obvious, and
Yeah.
everybody has it. And then there's this other answer which is really interesting, but I don't know the answer to that one either because they're all in stealth mode, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds good. I'm curious with Tesla, and as they develop their whole neural nets and you know machine learning experiences, like what other possibilities do you think exist for Tesla to leverage, that experience into new types of products or services or features? Like, because once they get down, let's say autonomous driving, and it's like, because it looks like it's just a matter of time, as they continue to push forward and they're doing the right things. They have all the pieces in place, and it just seems like, hey, just follow the path and you'll solve the problem, right? But with that, like, what's next for Tesla? Like, they built up all this, capacity, this ability, this learning, and where do they apply that next? Obviously they're going to continue their autonomous driving efforts and continue to get better and better over time. But is there anything else that you think Tesla can, move those resources to create more value?
Yeah, that's a really. I saw that question come up on the user comments on or the user questions on Twitter, and it my immediate reaction was that it prompted me to have an interesting thought, which actually doesn't answer the question, but that is that Tesla has developed a production process for building really big neural networks that like do really important things in the real world. I mean, Carpathy's data engine, right? And he's been basically out there telling people how to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could get a start on executing against this formula. So I'm really interested in robotics as and robotics is another application of similar kinds of things. The biggest problem in robotics, say you wanted to build, a humanoid robot, a
Yeah.
human scale robot that could do what that people can do. That would be a really useful device to have. It can do all kinds of useful things in the real world because it's a substitute for a human being in some pretty straightforward jobs. It drops into all these
Yeah.
different sort of functions in the real world today, delivering boxes or mowing the yard or whatever the deal is. You've got this one general purpose robot. Much like cars, the biggest problem they have is the problem of perception. Perception for a robot is a lot more complicated than perception for a car is because the environment is much less constrained, right? But one of the things I look at when I when I look at Karpathy's data engine, and this thing is, he's showing us the way to
Hmm.
build that perception engine for general purpose robotics, or drones or
Hmm.
delivery drones or
Sure,
whatnot. I mean,
sure.
that if you were Amazon and whatever you've been doing for the last couple of years for your delivery drone for making an environment, like Karpathy has shown you a model that you can cut and paste, expand,
Hmm.
as a way to like build a big neural network that's extremely effective in, very economically to solve a particular big problem. That that to me is a really interesting contribution that they're making right
Yeah.
now, is essentially they're showing the world how to go about solving this problem of leveraging this new technology now, right now,
Hmm.
not 10 years from now, after a lot of other people have pieces of the puzzle. Like they're
Yeah.
solving the whole problem
Yeah.
of creating an industrial process that builds a really big neural network to solve hard problems in the real
Exactly.
world. So when you ask the question, well, like what could Tesla do with that next? That's
Yeah.
actually a lot harder than like what could the world do with that next? There's
Yeah.
all kinds of interesting possibilities there.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating because, yeah, I actually have never connected the dots until right now, since right when you just mentioned that. I'm like, yeah, robotics, it's like, you'd think that
Bigger than cars. Yeah.
yeah, you'd think that like a transportation is like, typically what we know it as, like cars or trucks or something. But, transportation, and it's not just transportation, sustainable energy too, but a robot moving from point A to B or doing something on your behalf from point A to B, or, you know, whatever, that is in a way, it takes energy, it's a movement. And Tesla has expertise in, energy storage, and they don't have the robotics per se right now, but they're building more manufacturing expertise, year after year. But the whole perception problem, the whole, passive visual, the movement, using, neural nets and AI to move around and to successfully do that, that could be transferred to robots. And so, Tesla can transfer their battery storage, they can transfer their, neural nets or AI experience with
Electric
movement.
motor design.
Yeah,
Right.
electric motor design, all
Yeah,
that.
it's like that electric motor design. That's the single biggest kind of industrial problem. And like, if you want to make so I did this. I have
Mm,
a collaborator, and we basically work out business models that AI could be applied to. We've been doing this for a couple of years as
yeah.
kind of thought experiments to explore this stuff. And
Mm,
the humanoid robot one. So I did a design study trying to figure out. So say you wanted to make, you want to make you for $10,000, you want to build a robot, and it's approximately the size and weight of a human being. It can operate for like 8 hours on a charge or whatever.
mm,
What are the core technologies we don't have to do that today?
mm,
Right. And I looked at the batteries and the structural materials, and all that stuff is actually pretty easy. I was actually surprised. I didn't think the batteries would be good enough. Batteries are more than good enough to be able to do that stuff right now. But one thing, if you want to make a cheap, really
mm,
reliable robot, you need really simple joint motors, right? And it turns out that they're you can work forward from the physics principles to see what the shape is, and nobody's building those motors today,
mm.
right? I mean, they're totally buildable, but nobody's building those motors, right?
Huh.
So that's a piece of tech that somebody could
Yeah.
go and sort out. But the thing that's really missing is the perceptual system that lets a robot have a really good understanding of the environment so that it can
Mm,
interact with it, right?
yeah.
Much like cars, in the long run, planning will be neural networks too. And eventually all the control systems will also be neural networks. But relative to perception, those problems are relatively less important. Like,
Mm,
it's more important to get the perception down right now. And robots are kind of in a similar space right now.
yeah.
So, I mean, so that somebody's going to build
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
model,
exactly.
and building that a $10,000 robot that can basically do the
Yeah.
physical tasks that
Yeah.
human beings do. Man, that'd be a good
Mm.
market. Right? There are a lot of
Yeah,
things you
yeah.
could sell that into.
Yeah,
Will
definitely.
Tesla do it?
Yeah.
Man, I don't know if they have the bandwidth to go after that on top of all the other stuff that they're
Yeah.
that they're picking out. But if I was going to pick a company off the top of my head that I would
Yeah.
say, yeah, if they went after it, they could do it. Yeah, it would probably be Tesla right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, even drones too, it's like leveraging a lot of the stuff that Tesla's already working on. And then the whole comment by Elon saying that, hey, Tesla's long-term competitive advantage is going to be manufacturing.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, how do you take that? I mean, do you think, I mean, it seems a little bit counterintuitive because, you know, it seems like manufacturing is part of, the whole Tesla experience and their competitive advantage. But do you see that happening, and how do you see that happening? Is manufacturing
Yeah,
really going to
sure.
be like the long-term advantage or not?
So Tesla's an interesting entity because they're like being mission driven as opposed to
Mhm.
being profit driven, right? That changes the dynamic in a really interesting way. If you're profit driven, right, the thing that makes the most sense is to, in a kind of winner take all world that we like, if you can make a commodity for 10%
Mhm.
less than any of the competition, you can sell as much as you can make, right? Because, so the market favors people who do a little bit better than the competition, enough better to have a distinct, and then stop, right? And save further, stay ahead of the competition, but you don't need to spend a lot of money and take a lot of risk running way ahead of the competition, right? And you see a lot of companies do this, right? Like it's the standard model that we do. But when you're mission driven, right, your goal isn't to be 10% better than it's to go much farther down that line. And Tesla's like this super rare example of somebody who's gotten to scale, who's mission driven, right? So they didn't like, they built a Model S back in 2012, and it was better than any other electric car. And it wasn't like, hey, we got a good margin on this car, let's stay there. I mean, they
Mhm.
got the three, and it's a lot better, but the three keeps getting better. I mean, it's head and shoulders better than anything else that's out there,
Mhm.
and it's getting better and better and better. They have this skateboard design, which is it should be like, I don't know how other manufacturers feel about it, but it should be the envy of the manufacturing world. And they're, at battery world, they're like, we're getting rid of that skateboard. We're going to
Exactly.
go to this structural battery thing,
Mhm.
which is a lot better. So they're taking a lot of risk. They're making a huge investment in all these, in revamping the way that they do this stuff to basically, and I don't think this is because they're trying to open more water between them and the competition, right? It's
Mhm.
because they have this other goal farther down the road that 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 they want to get to. And when you think about them that way relative to kind of the classic way of doing business, you get a whole different set of answers for where they're going to end up and what they're going to do.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I definitely agree. Like I've been wrapping my brain around that whole concept of how unique kind of Tesla, but also Elon are with their whole mission driven focus. It's not that common, to have that strong of a mission
No,
focused
and
and
at scale, right? I mean,
exactly.
you see 10-man companies do this, or
Yeah,
50-man,
exactly. Yeah.
50-person companies do
And,
this kind of thing.
and the
But
and the scale of the mission being like kind of global and existential, you know the
yeah,
the whole existence of humanity on the brink type of
yeah,
level
it's a
problems.
phenomenon,
it's like
right?
it's like when you
It's not something that's happened like outside of war
exactly.
in like modern history, right?
Yeah, like when you take a step back, and if you take a step back just with a wide lens, 100 year, 200 year, whatever, it's like this stuff is like, and not just one company. Like one company would be pretty amazing, to have that type of ambition and and scale, and also pace of innovation and products. But for someone to be doing it across multiple companies, it's just yeah, I don't think people completely grasp what's happening because it's happening right now. It's like you kind of have to wait, in 20, 30 years down the
It's
road.
going to be interesting to see what the history books say about
Exactly.
this era,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, that I guess there were some questions on that list that were, talking about the singularity, or uh, I really, so the singularity, it's this term, it gets used lots of different ways, but it was coined by this science fiction author named Werner Vinge in basically a talk that he gave back to actually NASA back in the late 90s or something like that. And he was basically talking about how the difficult life of a science fiction writer who's trying to write science fiction in the near term, and how like over time it's getting harder and harder to write science fiction that looks out 20, 30, 40 years in the future, right? Because the pace of change is just picking up and up, right? And
Mhm.
so he had this mental construct, which was like, does that just keep happening? And he decided it did, right? He came to this idea. Well, what does that look like? Because, the pace of change as it gets steeper and steeper, I mean, you can see at some point you can see 25 years forward. And I think the US Navy, they used to do these 25-year projections. Like, what do we need in 25 years, and decide, well, this is what we need in planes and this is what we need in boats, or technology projections, right? And they just stopped doing that like 20 years ago. There's like, it's pointless, right? We got no idea what the world's going to look in 25 years. And Vinge was just basically saying, this is continuous. Like, so what happens when you can't tell what's going to happen tomorrow? Like that just keeps shorting. And he described that phenomenon as a singularity, that essentially there's this point in the future beyond which you cannot see. It's like a wall or this vague sort of, cloud or whatnot. And it's just coming closer and closer to us over time as we go. Right. And I like that sort of, that model of thinking about the pace of change in the world, that it's picking up and up and up and up. And what is this going to look like down the road when we're looking back at, are we even going to be looking back at it? Right. It's a strange thing to think about, but we've had these periods of significant technological disruption in the past. Like, 100 years ago, there was electrification and, telephony, and the railroads came into use, and then airplanes were invented, and there were just like all these big changes that happened. And then it felt like things kind of stabilized for a while. But now I look forward from where we're at, and I just see wave after wave. Like, we get to where there's no gap between the wave. It's just continuous disruption, like one piling on top of another. So, like, I look at the strategies that worked 100 years ago for people to be, relatively successful. And, I've tried to emulate those myself in my own sort of decisions, bet on disruption. You do the ARK Invest thing, right? Let's it's being on the side of disruption in an era of disruption. Those are the winners, right? And that's definitely, you do get a concentration of wealth that happens during those periods, because some people make these long bets and they pay off, and they pay off really big. You become Standard Oil or whatever the deal is. But then the pie gets a lot bigger too. And as the pie gets bigger and it affects everybody, then the dynamics of the whole situation change on top of that also.
Yeah.
And I think it becomes very hard to predict, like, what the world looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, I'm going to, I guess, wrap up the chat right now, because I feel like there's so many topics that we've talked about and you've mentioned, that I just feel like I actually had to hold myself back a lot in order to get through kind of a basic overview. Did
we run way over already?
No. I know you have to go around noon, but I had to hold back myself a lot just so we can get through kind of one pass overview on, full self-driving. But there's just like, good 20, 30 topics, it's like,
this is really fun.
Yeah. I would love to talk to you more about it. 'Cause I think a lot of times, like, especially in times where things are changing fast, like a lot of times people just don't take a step back and say, okay, let's really think about this, and let's really just try to figure things out, or at least to the best of our ability. And so I think it's actually a very valuable thing when people can actually, say, hey, wait a minute. Like I had this other thought like the other day with robotics, and hopefully we can talk about this later, but it's like, at what point does AI, like, I guess, merge with robotics to the point where humans like can't tell the difference between a human and a robot, right? Because like with AI, you have the whole Turing test where it's like, okay, like you have maybe text and it moves to audio and then video eventually, where, at a certain point, computers and AI are so good in their ability to communicate that humans, can't tell a difference between, if this is a computer or a human. And so it seems like we're reaching that point right now, and it's moving into not just audio, but now into video with these like deep fakes and kind of this whole thing where it's like, hey, is that video really a person, or is that, AI generated video or something? And so there's a lot of issues at hand. It's like, hey, there's a crisis of truth that could be coming, where it's like, how do you know what's real? Like, in terms of, is that a real person, or is that a created, something? Meaning our perception of what is real versus just, animated or created off the fly to perhaps even manipulate us or something, like that ability is starts to get in crisis. And I think for perhaps the first time in history where technology has gotten to the point where it's I won't say messing, but it's giving us a struggle, a new challenge that our previous generations and descendants have not had to deal with, at this level. And if you map out or project the future down the road and just take the steps, and that's the other thing. It's like, I think sometimes it's like you don't want to people don't want to think about the future because it's kind of overwhelming or we don't know, it's so ambiguous, etc. But if you do kind of take the future and say, hey, yeah, the pace of technology is improving. You've got these massive revolutions with not just the computer, with the internet, and now with artificial intelligence, and they're all converging. You could see a path where you have these humanoids or these robots, but they get so good in interacting with people that it's like you can't tell the difference with their voice or how they sound. But eventually, I could see a point where down the road, who knows what that point is, whether it's 10 years down the road or 30 or 40 years down the road, where, um, you know, the humanoid actually, whether it's people or AI, have figured out how to make that humanoid indistinguishable, like, with physical features, to the point where it's like you don't know if that's a real human or not. And that type of world where you could possibly make more humanoids than humans, right, in the world, um, because you don't have kind of this scarcity of human reproduction going on. You just who knows if
Bits are
general
smaller than atoms. Yeah.
exactly, yeah, if artificial general AI is able to, I don't know, let's say make billions and billions of humanoids or trillions, and humans can't even tell the difference. But then it comes to the point where at a certain point, it's like the power and the intelligence and the joint kind of ability of humans to even be a 0.0001% of the ability and capacity of general AI or the AIs out there is just so ridiculous. I mean, you can't compare anymore. And so this future, I mean, what's your take? I mean, obviously you've studied this area for a long time. Like, are you optimistic about the future that somehow we're going to be able to navigate all this, let's say 30, 40 years down the road? Or do you see some big risks and, like, I don't know, are you optimist in terms of that we can, overcome these challenges, or do you have some concerns as well?
I don't know. We're either going to overcome them or we're not, right? That's it. Elon's he's had. We must get past the great filter or whatever thing. You know about the Fermi paradox,
Mm-hmm.
the whole thing. Uh, yeah, it's going to be interesting. So what I've got to say, I don't think there's any formula. I think it's either gonna work out and we're gonna make it, or it's not gonna work out and we're not gonna make it. And I don't. I mean, if the Fermi paradox says we're not gonna make it, right? The Fermi paradox says you look at the universe, nobody else made it. Why would we make it, right? The great filter.
Actually, can you
Um,
explain this great filter from your perspective? What Elon
so
means by
the
this?
Fermi paradox Enrico Fermi was listening. The anecdote is Enrico Fermi was over listening some people at I think it was the, I forget, Princeton or something like that. He was listening to some neighboring table at lunch discuss the existence of aliens and whether they existed or not, something like that. And his observation was, well, where are they, right? Which it seems superficial. I mean, it seems like a trivial comment at first. But he essentially, what the comment is, the universe is really big and it's been here a really, really long time, like inconceivably long. And so if it's possible for a technological society to survive the era that we're in and become spacefaring or become, a Kardashev, a higher Kardashev level civilization, then you should be able to see them from a long ways away,
Mm-hmm.
right? We should hear their radio transmissions or something like that. But we look at this vast universe and there's nothing but silence, right? So since he made that observation, a lot of people, there are a bunch of books that you can find on the Fermi paradox and websites on it. I think Wait Not Why actually did a long article series on the Fermi paradox or something. But it's this, I guess, if you will, philosophical dilemma, right? Because if you just look at it if you take it at face value, you look at the universe and you look at how big it is, and the fact that it's empty suggests that technological civilizations don't survive, right? That they don't survive much beyond the stage that we're at right now. And that says kind of scary things about the world. It says really profound things about it. Anyway, so there's been all of this analysis about like, well, where could we be in this cycle? Have we already passed the thing that killed all the other civilizations off, right? So you have these various kinds of filters that you have to, these hurdles that you have to get past to continue to progress, right? I mean, life has to form, and maybe then you have to get to intelligent life, and then you need social life, and then you need technological and all that kind of stuff. And but what's the one that stops everybody? Why is the universe empty? Like, is there a rule, a thing which is so hard to get past that nobody gets past it? Nobody's ever gone past it, or getting past it is so rare that even though we can look out at the universe and we can see all of this empty space, that we see nobody who survived this thing, and that's the great filter, right? And so Elon's comment is alluding to this. And it's not difficult to look at where we are right now and look at the next couple hundred years and say, there's so many candidates for the great filter saying ahead of us. I mean, climate change is a pretty good example of that. Like maybe it's inevitable that if you get to a certain level of technology in a certain population, that you destroy the environment that you inhabit before you get the technology that lets you transcend that environment and get past it. Like maybe just every civilization does that, and that, so that's a candidate. There are other things too, like ennui, right? It's like, we're animals. We have an id. We have things that we want. We're learning machines. We learn, right? But we also have a reward function. Like we have a thing we want, and that's why we learn. I mean, we try to get closer to whatever this thing is that we desire. Well, once you have a certain level of technical capability, maybe everybody just has what they want, and things stop moving forward, and then you just die out, right? Yeah. Like that's another candidate for it. How far away are we from being able to do that? I don't know, probably a couple hundred years, right? From being able to do that kind of stuff. And so maybe that's our great filter, right? That we get to. And I mean, one way of seeing what SpaceX is doing is like trying to sidestep that, and that what looks like this inevitable end, which is coming for human civilization.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to look at the universe and be optimistic on the one hand about when you look at this. There are lots of things we don't know, and there are other interpretations. I mean, the Fermi paradox it's not a set thing. It's not the be all end all of philosophy on this topic, but it's the more time you spend, the more you realize a lot of really smart people spend a lot of time thinking about this, and we don't really have a resolution to it. And it says kind of scary things about the moment in time that we occupy as a civilization right now.
Yeah.
So.
All right, James. Thanks again for joining.
Super fun.
Time.
I hope you can edit it down to something.
No.
That will be acceptable to people.
I don't really. My first priority isn't per se to have a ton of views. Like my first priority actually is to learn myself, and to actually go through and to get to know you and actually like have a conversation that's, of value. So yeah, I'd love to do it again. If you're open at some point of time.
Sure.
I already have like,
it was fun.
5 or 10 topics I'd love to chat with you more about. So
great.
Awesome, man. Thanks. And then where can people find you if they wanted to kind of keep up or follow you? I know you're on Twitter at James Douma? Is that correct?
Yes, James Douma.
Douma. Okay. So James, Douma, right?
Right.
Okay. Is there anywhere else? On Tesla Motors Club, you're Jimmy_D, I think, right? Okay.
I'm not super active on social networks, honestly.
All right.
I mean, I'm following you on Twitter, so people who follow you can probably find me in the follower list if they really want to DM me about something.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, thanks a lot, James. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care. Have a good one.
Okay, bye. All right. Thanks.